There's one thing that almost everyone on Earth can agree on. No matter what religion you are, what race you are, what ethnicity you are, or even what time period you were born in. Something people thousands of years ago believed in, and something people years in the future will probably still believe in. It's that war is bad, and that's generally a good idea for us to avoid war. And from here stems a very important idea in politics. The idea of diplomacy. The idea that instead of getting what I want through violence, I can just talk to them. That was certainly what the British thought when Hitler was taking over a bunch of countries in Europe in the 1940s. It's what American and Soviet leaders thought during the Cold War, and it's what attempts to mediate between Russia and Ukraine have sought to do. It's the goal which talks in Istanbul, Cairo, Muscat, Doha, Islamabad, Washington have all sought to achieve. Many times though, these talks are just ineffective. It almost feels like diplomacy has a type of bad reputation, that it's only for people who aren't grounded in reality. So then I had to ask, why doesn't diplomacy work? And when does it work? If it even does? To answer that question, I thought, why not turn to one of the masters of statescraft, Henry Kissinger. Like him or hate him, bad deeds and good deeds, I think we can all agree that this man was smart. Working as America's Secretary of State, he oversaw negotiations with the Soviet Union, the controversial ending of the Vietnam War, and a great part of the peace process between Egypt, Syria, and the State of Israel. And luckily for us, he wrote a book on just the topic I'm looking for. And what do you know? It's literally called Diplomacy. Now I know this man has his problems, but what I'm looking for isn't necessarily a single definitive answer, but more so just clues or signs from somebody that has experience. One thing that we need to understand about Kissinger is his thinking. He was a realist. Realism in simple terms focuses on one primary thing, power. And this book repeats one concept several times, balance of power. Balance of power basically means that every country in a specific region has its own power, and that these powers naturally bump up against one another, with weaker countries being taken over by stronger countries. But maybe at a certain point, a strong country will meet another strong country, and because they are equals in strength, nobody can easily take over the other. Quote, "It works best when it keeps dissatisfaction below the level at which the aggrieved party will seek to overthrow the international order." Kissinger then goes on to recount the history of diplomacy in Europe, explaining how several times European countries got together and agreed on a system to govern themselves with, and that these systems, although they weren't necessarily democratic, they did what they could to maintain stability and avoid large-scale wars. Perhaps this comes from the idea that countries just can't keep on forever fighting their enemies non-stop without any end. So instead of that, they decide to come together and reach a sort of arrangement or a diplomatic solution. And that can make sense today. The world has many powers balancing against each other. Russia against America, against China, etc., etc. It would be very dumb, to be honest, for these countries to be forever at war with each other, which is why even if they're enemies, they try to come to some sort of arrangement, even if it's informal. A great example of this is America and Iran, before the war I mean. The United States and Iran cut diplomatic ties with each other in the 1980s, and have so far not re-established them since. But both America and Iran have power in the Middle East that neither side can simply ignore. And maybe that's one reason why in 2015, they decided to get together and create this thing called the Iran nuclear deal, which was one possible diplomatic answer to their issues. But we still haven't answered though what the problem with diplomacy is. Why, for example, the Iran nuclear deal fell apart, and why other attempts at negotiation since then failed. And why can't Russia and Ukraine come to a similar deal? Or even Hamas and the Israelis? Well, I had to look further, and I tried to think of a historical case study that, although it wouldn't give me the full answer, nothing will, it could at least give me some signs of success and some signs of failure. I thought about Kissinger again, and decided to look back at his own history as a diplomat. And that's when I found, I think, this great example. But first, some background. We need to go back to the year 1967. In 1967, the State of Israel and several Arab countries didn't really like each other, so they went to war. And in this war, the Israelis took over many Arab territories, including the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and the Golan Heights from Syria. The Egyptians and the Syrians naturally didn't like this. So 6 years later, in 1973, they got together and launched a surprise attack on the Israelis. I'm going to focus mainly on Egypt. The Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal and retook parts of Sinai. But the Israelis also crossed the Suez Canal and took over parts west of the Suez Canal. At that point, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire and began diplomatic negotiations. Why did they do that? Well, luckily for me, Kissinger was a key mediator between the Egyptians and the Israelis as America's Secretary of State at the time, and perhaps he can give some insight as to why. Before I continue, I should say that the Syrian side of this story is also very important, but for the sake of time, I'm going to mainly focus on the Egyptian front. Reading about the situation, one thing is apparent: the balance of power I mentioned earlier, or more specifically, how the balance of power worked. The Israelis, to begin with, were in a difficult position. So much so that even Kissinger himself had to point it out. In a meeting with then Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, Kissinger told her, quote, "We are faced with a very tragic situation. You didn't start the war, but you face a need for wise decisions to protect the survival of Israel. This is what you face. But this is my honest judgment as a friend. Meir, you're saying we have no choice. Kissinger, we face the international situation that I described to you." At the same time though, Egypt wasn't doing great either, because the Israelis occupied territories west of the Suez Canal and cut off supply lines to the Egyptian army in Sinai. What this means is that both sides had power, but their power was balanced. Although the Egyptians were in a tough position, so were the Israelis. And because of that, both sides had an incentive to pursue a diplomatic solution. But as I said, that's basically just a prerequisite to diplomatic success. Once the two sides got together to talk, it was clear there was a big problem. A problem that all diplomatic talks have to deal with. In almost every single diplomatic negotiation, you find two sides who want two very different things from each other. Many people call this the gap between them. In Ukraine, that gap could be NATO membership versus giving up Donbass. In the Middle East, that gap could be a Palestinian state versus an Israeli state. In Iran, it could be support for Shia militias versus sanctions relief. And it is the bane of every honest diplomat to bridge that gap, to find a way to bring these two sides together. And it's certainly what Kissinger had to do between the Egyptians and the Israelis in 1973. And in 1973, the gap between the two sides was quite large. To even begin negotiations, the Egyptians wanted the Israelis to leave Sinai, and the Israelis wanted the Egyptians to recognize the state of Israel. So there was a gap, and that gap had to be bridged. And what led to that gap being bridged? The thing with these questions is that it's quite difficult to find a single thing or a single answer that explains everything. But analyzing the situation and Kissinger's own take on the negotiations, there were two things that stood out to me. The first is something we talk about a lot in general, but rarely as a concept, and that is character. And in character, we find a key player to the Egyptian-Israeli peace process, and that was Egypt's president at the time, Anwar Sadat. Sadat is hailed by many as a very smart person. Kissinger himself certainly thought so, saying, "To his strategic imagination, Sadat added extraordinary human qualities: fortitude, empathy, audacity, and a gravitas, at once practical and mystical." All of these were part of Sadat's character, and it greatly affected diplomacy. How smart he was, how he talked about the other side, how trusted he was, how open or closed off he was to certain ideas, all of these greatly affected the fate of diplomacy. And the thing is, when I think about the world today, I don't need to go far to find someone who will curse out Putin, Netanyahu, or Trump, or somebody that thinks that Hamas are terrorists, that Iran's regime are evil, or that Zelensky is corrupt. But I wonder, do the people who say these things consider what the character of the people they don't like mean on a political level? Well, Kissinger's insight gives us some idea. He recounts how Sadat, after meeting him for the first time, made a very important decision, which was to agree to a 6-point agreement with the Israelis, which included a military disengagement by both sides. According to Kissinger, Sadat believed that establishing trust and goodwill was more important than winning quick concessions from the Israelis. That is so important, and it's often overlooked. It's a basic law of human interaction. How can I make a deal with you if I don't trust you? How can I accept your promises if I don't believe in them, and all you've done is break every single promise you have made? When we think about negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, we need to consider these overlooked qualities. It doesn't even matter who's in the right or who's in the wrong. It's a question that every politician should have. Why should Ukraine trust Vladimir Putin? Why should Russia trust Vladimir Zelensky? Why should Iran trust Trump? Why should America trust Iran's leaders? Why should Arabs trust Netanyahu? And why should Netanyahu trust Arabs? And that may be one reason why deals often break down, because nobody trusts the other side's promises. Because sometimes, like between Russia and Ukraine, America and Iran, or even between the Palestinians and the Israelis, there's just so much bad blood between them. And Egypt certainly was no exception to the rule. By that time, the country had fought 4 different wars with the Israelis. One in 1948, one in 1956, one in 1967, and the most recent one by that point, 1973. This was probably why Sadat's decision to generate some trust and goodwill was absolutely crucial to diplomacy. In what arguably generated more trust and goodwill, 4 years later in 1977, Sadat upped the stakes and accepted an Israeli invitation to Jerusalem to visit and speak at the Israeli Knesset, or the Israeli government, which was very controversial to this day. But it proves another thing. Character doesn't just mean trust, it also means openness and opposition to a certain idea. And Sadat definitely had to be open to all of this. So trust was being built, and the two sides had power over each other, meaning the balance of power was fitting. But there's a third factor, which I think is very crucial to understanding why diplomacy succeeded. But before we go to that third thing, I should say that these two factors on their own may be enough to make peace between two nations, especially in conflicts that don't have as much bad blood as the Arab-Israeli conflict does. I guess the problem with diplomacy is that most conflicts just don't have that much trust and goodwill, and many don't try hard enough to achieve it. I should also say that one case study certainly doesn't speak for every case, and it's quite possible that there are many other factors that I just didn't mention. But there's one more thing in the Egyptian-Israeli peace process that I just can't help but notice. Sadat, as I said, was hailed by many as a very smart man, and he made many of the most important decisions that led to peace, including the way in which he carried out the 1973 war and the steps he took to generate trust and goodwill with the other side. But Sadat, the way I see it, may have made the most important decision in this story, and that was the choice to ally himself with the United States. Why was this an important decision? Well, first of all, it probably wasn't an easy decision. It was America, after all, who sent all that support to the Israelis during the war. But it was precisely because of that this choice was crucial. And it goes back to two things. The first of which, if Egypt tied itself to America and made deals and propositions with the Americans, then it would essentially be giving America a proposition. That proposition is, be my friend, support my military, and help me get my land back, or you will lose my country's strategic geographic location and its voice in the Arab world to your great enemy, the Soviet Union. At that point, the Americans would have to make a choice, a comparison between two outcomes. Either let the Israelis have Sinai, but keep Egypt in the Soviet sphere, or be allies with both the Israelis and the Egyptians. At that point, if things worked out correctly, the Israelis may be comfortable giving up Sinai. And America itself was uniquely positioned to play this role because of how invested it was in the state of Israel. Kissinger himself even points this out, saying Sadat believed that the Americans hold more than 99% of the cards in the game. According to Kissinger, Instead of the Egyptians and the Israelis making commitments to one another, which would begin the debate of who surrendered to who, both sides would instead make mutual commitments to America. And that was Sadat's idea. This point was very crucial, especially when we compare it to the Syrian experience. Syria, as I said, joined Egypt in the war and tried to take back the Golan Heights, which, like happened with Egypt and Sinai, Syria had lost in 1967. And when the ceasefire happened in 1973, the Syrians agreed to begin negotiations at the mediation of Kissinger. But Syria's president at the time, Hafez al-Assad, who was this man's father, differed from Sadat in one major way. Kissinger recounted how one time, Assad told him that Syria was betrayed by Turkey, and then Britain and France, and then America, when it chose to support the State of Israel. And that because of that, he didn't have much incentive to cooperate with America or its British, French, and Turkish allies. Whether you agree or disagree with him, that's just what he thought, and it greatly limited the trust between American and Syrian negotiators. Moreover, reading Kissinger's experience, it's clear that his relationship with Sadat was much more positive than his relationship with Assad. Perhaps because of this, the Syrians never reached as deep an agreement with the Israelis as the Egyptians had done, because Assad didn't want to tie himself with America as Sadat did. In any case, the dynamics at play between Cairo and Tel Aviv would eventually pave the way for a full Israeli withdrawal from Sinai and the signing of the Camp David Accords in 1978, after which Egypt would receive massive amounts of US military aid. When 47 years later, in January 2025, US President Donald Trump issued an order to pause all foreign aid to all countries across the planet, only 2 countries were exempt. The first was, unsurprisingly, the State of Israel, but the second was Egypt. So those were 3 things: power, character, a good mediator. The Egyptians and the Israelis had a balance of power, trust was built between them, and both had a good mediator in America, a side which both of them trusted and which was heavily invested in the dispute in a way that benefited everyone. Don't forget, all 3 sides had the intelligence to recognize every opportunity and take it, which isn't the case for every conflict. Moreover, unlike in Syria, both sides were willing to take this route, even if it was controversial. I should also say that there were other factors that did lead to the peace deal, including the demilitarization of Sinai, which would act as a buffer between Egypt and the State of Israel, and the presence of the Americans, which probably served to reassure the Israelis. But these nonetheless go back to the 3 main principles I mentioned earlier: that America was a good mediator, and that Sadat's character was open to this possibility and to this situation, which was, of course, bringing in the Americans. I should also say that these are probably not the only things that make diplomacy either succeed or fail, and that there are probably also a lot of other things that I maybe didn't notice and didn't mention, but that are also really important. But these are at least 3 factors determining the outcome of diplomacy. So that's it then. Character, trust, and diplomacy. Could those be the missing keys to diplomacy? The problems of diplomacy, if you will? I guess what I'm trying to say, are those the reasons why negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, the Israelis and Hamas, Iran and America have failed? Beginning with Russia and Ukraine, it's clear that there's just a very little trust on both sides. And honestly, so long as the war keeps going and attacks by both sides on each other continue, it may be difficult to generate any trust and goodwill. Russia can invite Zelensky to Moscow, for example, but how can Zelensky be reassured that he'll make it back to Ukraine safely? And that may be why American attempts at mediation just haven't been successful. America can't force Russia to like and accept Zelensky, nor can America just force Ukraine to give up its land. Nor can the Egyptians or the Qataris get the Palestinians and the Israelis to trust each other without any concrete steps towards building such trust, especially if the 2 sides keep attacking each other. And when it comes to America and Iran, if the Iranians can't trust America to keep its promises, then why would they accept it to begin with? And that, as I said, is a part of character. The Trump administration's hardline position on Iran likely doesn't reassure Iran's leaders, nor do Iran's leaders help the situation by refusing any concessions. And when reports indicated that Iran did accept limited uranium enrichment, which could have paved the way for a diplomatic solution, as mediators from Oman had said, the war was started anyway. Similarly in Gaza, it's doubtful that maximalist positions by either side would lead to peace. And in Ukraine, the same thing. But I think the most important lesson to take from the Egyptian-Israeli peace process is creativity. The choice to have America oversee the Israeli withdrawal from Sinai in exchange for Egyptian recognition of the State of Israel was complex, unorthodox, and it was 100% risky. But it was creative. It was a solution that saw Egyptian territory return, but assuaged fears of Israeli security. Such a solution required open-mindedness, and to many people, it was accepting a partial solution to a bigger problem. And maybe because of that, as I said, it was risky. In Ukraine, Palestine, and Iran, such solutions may be very helpful. But there is one thing I can say with confidence, and it's that war doesn't work. Russia is currently bogged down in Ukraine. The Israelis have yet to completely eliminate Hamas, and America looks like it's trying to back out of Iran. History is full of wars that seemed easy, but ended in disaster, not for the person who got attacked, but for the person who attacked. If you want to learn about the opposite of diplomacy, war, then check out that video. If you like this one, you'll probably like that one too. Thank you for watching.